was thinking about this the other day, and maybe I'll try to unpack it. This was actually quite a while ago when I was just going into I entertain a lot of different life experience ideas. And so this topic of aliens, like not aliens in terms of native foreign alien, but like extraterrestrial, like alien beings and entities. And I'm not really an expert in that world of study. I know enough of the general idea. For instance, I hadn't heard of like these recent proposals about these alien beings that are like I don't even want to say it because I don't want to get off track onto this topic, like white, blonde haired, but very much so, like almost white hair, white, blondish hair. And I hadn't heard of that. I hadn't heard of those stories. I've always heard of alien extraterrestrial stories with those beings that we all imagine, like you see in the emoji, those gray with the big eyes and whatnot. Something though that I just find curious about this idea of aliens is that something about them. So, okay, let's see. How do I unpack this idea? There's this assumption that aliens become this entity or being that is so more advanced than us, right? They have their spaceships and they travel through tapping into other mechanisms, and then they have this kind of uniformity about their outward appearance and whatnot. And I kind of question that that line of thinking in terms of associating advanced progression with those ideas, because the more that I kind of look into the framework of this general trajectory of where life seems to go, it doesn't seem to point at those types of hyper advancement through streamlined like spaceships and uniformed appearance. That seems to indicate a tendency of a trapped mind that pushes toward a heightening level of progression as a type of escapism, not necessarily a breakthrough of advancement. And the reason I generally think that, and I could be wrong, this is why I'm trying to work through this, is because almost every form of closed systems that end up collapsing go along those lines. For instance, stories like The Brave New World, or those like dystopian type movies like The Giver or The Stepford Wives, or, things like that. Basically, these scenarios where people attempt to solve for pain and a complex system with hyper control, hyper sterilization, uniformity, and usually like they clear out forests and they have like sidewalks and controlled pathways and a type of hyper minimalism. And I'm not against those things. I think you can have those in maybe more of a healthy version. For instance, I like some of the old pictures, these ideas when you walk through like museums, and there is some sense of a simplicity with like monastery type living. Strangely, like I've seen these books where there's this nice like white room with like just a bed and a nightstand and just the utility of the basic things that you need. So I'm not totally against that. And I'm not against the idea of like the utility of cement pathways, because they're nice to have in high traction. there's a usefulness, basic usefulness, high traffic areas. It's useful. But I mean, I think you know what I mean in terms of a world where it's just that. Everything is controlled. There's no forests. There's no layers of natural life and things like that. And so it's just this repeat tendency for people the tendency in systems for people to push advancement when it gets to the stage of complex systems, to push advancement towards those type of dystopian, hyper-controlled world. And then that's the selling point, right? And they don't know how to solve for the increased felt layers of complexity. And so they kind of just get rid of everything, right? And so if you see that as a pattern and a tendency, and that general notion of associating with the inability to solve for that at that stage of development, this escaped route coinciding with this hyper technology, it doesn't come across as solving the life riddle. It doesn't come across as tapping into the energy or the unique experience that in a different way solves for those things. And so I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from when I imagine, why do we think this? Why are we perceiving that this is the next step in advancement when it doesn't coincide with resolving any of this other stuff, which is the pattern, like I was saying, of not solving for these stages of difficulty with systems, and not solving for the complexities of the emotion and the network of connection and stuff like that. So that's kind of me explaining how I don't associate that imagery and practice and action with hyper advancement, entering into the mechanisms of the mystery of life. I tend to think you go in a different direction to some degree, where you look at the network. So for me, what I feel is feels closer to tapping into that connection are these curious studies, which I'm not even saying whether these are accurate or not, but these curious studies that have to do with string theory, going deep into creation, not escaping out of it necessarily. And these questions that people are finding when they do that there's these peculiar networks of animals, magnetic fields, coordinates that they follow. There's these peculiar networks of trees, how they communicate. There's peculiar networks of mushrooms and fungi and things like that. To the point where you go deep into this interconnectedness in the tapestry of creation, that it feels like that's where we take more of this deep dive into what's peculiar about the potential of existence and other things like that. And then through that, we find peculiar ways to resolve some of the mysteries of advancement or breakthrough and things like that. Shifting into those other areas of our potential that are required to make that leap. So, but that's not saying that it's this split between, being against other types of innovation. So then when I try that on and I think, could there be something about that though associated with extraterrestrial, spaceships, things like that are associated with a type of this other type of breakthrough that I I'm thinking about, or do they? I mean, I've heard different stories, where people will say no, they're demonic, or other people will say, well, no, they come around when there's a threat on the human race to fall into nuclear war, when we're at almost like they pose a corrective measure, which then kind of reminds me of, and I'm not saying, I'm just talking, I'm not saying whether I believe this or any of this stuff. It's just these peculiar things, right? And so then that reminds me of like in Hunger Games, where to keep the system and the game going, it can't, like, the tension in the network helps keep it going. And if like the tension falls too far one way or another, then the game inserts these little floating entities, these like drones or whatever, that come in and they deliver like a useful tool or something. And so it just like keeps it going. And it almost seems like that a little bit, and I think that's where, it's kind of like, does our subconscious like conjure that up? Like, are we all participants in like a voluntary game that we're in? And then we deliver these like useful tips once in a while that arrive within, I don't know, it's just kind of strange. So they're kind of saying how spaceship activity increases at times where we're almost losing the game, the experience game, nuclear war, other things like that. You hear other things too. Like there's different groups, just like humans. Some are more evil, some are more good, da-da-da-da-da. But even the delivery, because here's the thing, when you study nature, or when you look into people that study nature, there's a function in your package delivery. So at least in our existence that we understand on Earth, even like the physics of existence that we study, there's the things that form into a visual appearance that you're seeing, that you're visualizing, have grown in relation to your environment. So you can read the mapping of an environment, like by the imagery of things to some degree. There's like a function of it. There's some degree of a function of it. And so when you look at the imagery, like the general imagery, like I said, I don't know too much about these other stories about these other extraterrestrial entities, beings. But the general notion, like the gray kind of uniform body image with the big dark eyes that seem somewhat telepathic. What does that have to say? Like, what type of environment would produce that type of a creature? Comparable to our experience, it does seem more like a water creature. And so, that could kind of make sense if I'm trying to put a nature component to it, so it doesn't seem to be too much of a escaped from an environment type entity. Because so I guess maybe it would speak to almost like a lizard type quality, right? Like a water lizard type quality, almost like a water dog. If you've ever heard of those lizards, those water dogs, they can go on land and they can go in the water. And also within water species, there is a sense of like a uniformed capsule that creatures travel in. And it is like an environmentally formed mechanism, like shells and stuff. I don't know. So if I'm just kind of supposing that, it is just a peculiar thing to think about. I think in terms of like a created being, it does make you wonder. So, like with animals or people, or even plants, there's some kind of interaction, right? There's some kind of network that we exist among, like a currency, I guess you would say. And so humans then move through our day having to navigate shelter and food and relationships to some degree, and evolving, strategizing that along this mode of always being in this flow of this forward motion, right? And so it is just kind of curious to think, what is their currency then? Like, what do they do? So if it's like compared to a plant, so say like a plant, there's a certain network of plants and they have this interaction with the sun, water, sun, things like that. That's just, I don't know, some side note there. I could try to apply that to something else, but that's just a little side note of like thinking about systems and interaction. So I also think it's, it is just kind of interesting that people assume they're like a hostile entity. And it kind of leads us to have to examine, if you're applying the Rorschach test, like the ink blot test, like, what do you see with this experience? It's like, oh, I see hostility. And it's like, well, maybe you need to deal with like your lens of hostility that you see things through. Like it says more about the person making those claims than the actual situation sometimes, or it could speak to the situation. But anyway, that serves to suggest that a lot of how we perceive things in our network of humanity is through a level of hostility or level of threat or gauging survival. But when we think about, spirituality and stuff like that, I mean, there still is levels of gauging the conditions we already find ourselves in, the network of survival and layers of predators and whatnot within the network of creation. But then the question, does it always have to be like that? And the idea that if there's units of life where needs are met, does it minimize the tendency to see things like that? And it is just a lot of peculiar things to think about. Like, are they really hostile entities, or is that how we appear to imagine things? And our fear also is that we would hope that they would be respectful of our sensory perception, not inadvertently or on purpose being torturous to us or things like that, understanding our currency, understanding our life mechanisms and whatnot. So anyway, it's just curious to think about that, like really examining what is it that we think we're perceiving and why are we perceiving that, and why do we still tend to be at that stage of general notions of humanity. Even the question of like wanting things, or the want or the currency or the why of even experiencing an experience. But it's hard for us to get to those points of question because we're still on very basic notions of being honest with like creating a very basic system of functionality, at some level among humanity. But yeah, I don't know, like it's just curious to think about.